I don't know about you all, but I am deeply, deeply tired. And that's kind of where I've sat as I have been trying to listen to God and listen for what, what He's saying to me and what He's saying to us. Because this is not an easy time, I would say. Life feels a bit overwhelming. And recently, myself, I felt very, very lost and trapped and scared in a lot of different places. And I'd imagine that I'm not the only one in this time. And we as a congregation have been through a lot, especially over the past year and a half. And yeah, I've just been sitting with that messiness. And even just living in this world is difficult. Just the way that we walk is different than the world. And so many people are so averse to hearing about Jesus, and even speaking his name can ostracize us at times. And it's a lot to wrestle with. So I've been thinking about these things, and I don't say them to grumble or complain. Last time I spoke to you all, I recognized the narrative that God's calling us into, that it's not a comfy, cushy one, that we're expected to suffer for the gospel and we expect to be persecuted for God. I know that's not a surprise. And I like to forget it at times because I like to be comfortable. But I really do know these truths in my head. And my heart is being molded continually, and I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like to live in, and what it looks like to live in what honestly feels like a very dangerous world at times. Because the challenges that we're facing right now are not ending as soon as we'd like. They're not wrapping up as we'd hoped. And we're seeing just how little control we seem to have. So I think we have a responsibility to figure out how to live within those things, to not be contaminated by them, and to remain faithful in God's love. And to that end, I wanted to turn to Daniel today and read through three of the stories in the book of Daniel. The beginning of the exile, the interpretation of the king's dream, and the fires. And I'm sure you're all familiar with these stories. I just encourage you to just sit with them, to meditate on them, and to let the Spirit speak to you in new ways, even if you know the stories by heart. So the book of Daniel, as you may know, is an account of the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, and it includes stories and prophetic visions for the future. As much as I'd like to read through all of the chapters, I'll kind of break it up and take us through what's been speaking to me recently. So Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, and young men that could meet some kind of need in his service were taken, and they were to be trained and kind of sorted out later. So starting in Daniel chapter 1, verse 6. It says, among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. And right away, I just want to pause here because we see something really big that happens. Our four friends here are given new names by those who basically abducted them. It's really easy to skip and just move on to the rest of the story, but I think it's really profound because I think about names, and names are how we are identified. And names in many ways, especially in Daniel's day, hold great meaning, especially about our identity. And their new names that they were given, that was the beginning of a process of changing their identities. They weren't just taken, they were being changed, or they were trying to be changed. It was an act of violence against their very being and against their relationship with God. I looked up their Hebrew names, and they mean God is my judge. My God is gracious. Who is what God is? And God has helped. Those were their names before they were taken. And their new names are references to Babylonian deities. The renaming of our friends here was an act of trying to erase and replace God. And I sat with that for a bit and I thought about it. Because I think there are times today, and I wonder if you feel the same way, where you feel like people are trying to erase God, to replace God, to attack your relationship with God. Because you're not alone. This was happening long before we came around. And for me, I'm the target of a constant stream of labels and names with meanings that I don't always ask for. And I don't necessarily agree with the meanings all the time. I'm labeled as a student, a psychology student, a therapist in training, a young adult, a man, an American. And if I'm not careful, I could let these labels define me. And I could let others dictate who I am by these labels that they place on me and their meanings for these labels. It's so often said that how could I be a psychology student and believe in God? Like those things are not held as, that's not held as a thing that could happen. And when that happens once or twice, it's easy to just kind of deflect and move on. But when it's constant, when people are trying to rename you and change your identity, that's difficult. And I don't want them to replace the truth and dictate who I am. I don't want them to replace the truth that I am a dear child of a merciful and loving God, and that you all are children of a merciful and loving God. No matter what other people say, no matter how they perceive you, I just want us to remember that. Moving on, I think this picks up in verse, I hope Kaylee knows where it is. Yes, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Sorry, I'm trying to watch the slides. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. And every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. 10 times better. Daniel stood up for the truth in that moment and refused to defile himself and risked facing serious punishment. And he was able to convince the guard to feed he and his friends only vegetables and water for 10 days. And they were rewarded for their faith and good stewardship. And whereas it would be easy to fear the negative consequences, and oh boy, do I know how easy it is to fear the negative consequences, they did not let that fear disrupt their faith. They did not let that fear disrupt their faith. And after some time had passed, we pick up again in chapter 2, starting with verse 1. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. And some back and forth occurred, and we pick up again in verse 10. And it says, the astrologers answered the king, there is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. And this made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all of the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death because they were a part of this group. What started as what looked like them being praised and them putting in this big position put them in danger. There wasn't safety and security there yet, or so they thought. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went in to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. And eventually he goes on to talk with the king about this, but that's not the important part right now for my heart. The important part is that their lives were being threatened. I talked about feeling like the world is dangerous for me sometimes, but my life isn't always threatened in that way. I just think about the weight of that. They were being hunted, and I would have been petrified with fear. It would have been easy to run anywhere where they couldn't be found. But their first response was not to run. Rather, they looked up and they prayed for mercy, and they prayed that God would have his way. And like I said, Daniel later returns to the king to interpret the dream. We won't dive into that interpretation right now, but this is what happens right after that, picking up in Daniel chapter 2, verse 45. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. And the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. Again, God was providing a way, and he was changing even the most hard of hearts. The king, the one who had hunted them, fell and bowed before Daniel, bowed before God's truth and revelation and honor. And we often hear about how every knee will bow. And this moment, I believe, is a beautiful example of this. Even the king, a man who likely thought he had it all figured out, thought he was secure, thought he had earned his security, bowed to the Lord of Lords and God of Gods. And when I feel like there are authorities over me, that there are people in power that threaten me, I can rest easy in the knowledge that every knee will bow, no matter what. Later, in chapter 3, we come to a point where the king set up an idol and threatened all the subjects to bow before it. And there's a lot to unpack there. But what stood out to me was the beautiful display of loyalty to God, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to worship the idol. It goes on to say in chapter 3, starting in verse 13, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" And this is really beautiful. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Even if, every time I read that, I get chills. Yes, our God is unfathomably loving and gracious and can save us from any peril. And yet, we cannot grasp the extent of his plans or will. So our loyalty to him is not contingent on him behaving how we want. Our love for God does not require God to live up to our expectations. God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and he's defined by so much more than we could begin to imagine ourselves. And when I think about the kind of faith I want, the kind of faith that I want to show to the world, it's that even if kind. That even if things don't look how I want, I will not bow to idols, and I will not turn away from God. That said, that is also the kind of faith that enrages those who don't understand it, as we could see. And we'll see how the king responds. Next it says, then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And I like to imagine that there's a pause here. And then it goes on to say that then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement. And he asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubber, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. That's, I get speechless at that part, you know? It's just such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful display. And again, seeing the king bow once more. It's also beautiful. And Dave and Diane, if you are available to come back for a moment, there's a song that I've asked them to play that ties into these verses. It's called "Another in the Fire." And after they play it, we'll come back and I have some closing thoughts. But I just want you to listen to these lyrics and meditate on them for a moment.
There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding, power set me free. There is a grave. Actually, I got some of the words mixed up. Let's go back. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the water, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding how I've been set free? There is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. There is another in the fire. Keep it up there. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding how I've been set free? There is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. I can see the light. I can see the light in the darkness, as the darkness bows to him. I can hear the roar in the heavens, as the space between wears thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us, as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. Do that again. I can see the light in the darkness, as the darkness bows to him. I can hear the roar in the heavens, as the space between wears thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us, as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. To be another in the fire, standing next to me. To be another in the waters, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me? I'll count the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. Was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another should I ever need reminding how I've been set free? There is the cross that bears the burden, where another died for me.
Thank you, Dave and Diane. I appreciate that. And I think that one of the most beautiful parts of that song is this progression through the chorus. And it's subtle and it's easy to miss, but it goes, there was another in the fire. And then later it goes, there is another in the fire. As it ends, we hear there'll be another in the fire. God has been with us, He is with us, and will continue to walk alongside us. Again, He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And as followers of Jesus, we're sure to face challenges, we're sure to face exile, pressure from authorities, and seemingly hopeless trials. But in the midst of that, God is there with us. And He will be there with us for those trials to come. And as you meditate on that, I just want you to consider these three questions that I've been asking myself. When everyone is telling you who you are, who are you listening to? And when you encounter threats, where do you turn first? And when you're in the fire, do you look around to see who's there with you? And there they are. Thank you, Kaylee. I just encourage all of us to consider these questions as we head into this week.